And in the study, we've also looked at early Neanderthals that are 400,000 years old, and they also have that same distinctive growth pattern found in the later Neanderthals and in this child from Devil's Town.
When scientists sequenced the DNA of a 40,000-year-old Neanderthal, they expected a window into the past. Instead, they found something that shouldn't exist: genetic patterns that defied classification, connections no theory could explain. What started as a routine analysis quickly turned into one of the most baffling discoveries in modern genetics. Some say it rewrote evolution itself. Others insist we still don't understand what we're looking at. Is it something impossible? The day science got it wrong. It started, as most breakthroughs do, with data that didn't make sense. In 2010, a team of geneticists led by Svante Pääbo at the Max Planck Institute successfully sequenced the Neanderthal genome, the first time science had decoded the complete genetic blueprint of our long-extinct relatives. The goal was simple: compare it to modern humans and finally settle how much of them still lived in us. What they didn't expect was how much did. Roughly 1 to 4% of the average non-African human's DNA, they found, came directly from Neanderthals. It was proof that humans and Neanderthals hadn't just coexisted. They'd interbred. But even that wasn't the shock. The real mystery lay in what came next: sequences of DNA in the 40,000-year-old samples that didn't match Neanderthals or Homo sapiens. These segments were, in every sense, foreign. At first, researchers assumed it was contamination, perhaps modern DNA accidentally mixed into the ancient sample. But after multiple tests, replication in different labs, and independent verification from institutions in the US, Russia, and France, the results stayed the same. These genetic patterns were authentic. And worse or better, they didn't fit any known branch of the human family tree. That was the first sign that the story of human evolution wasn't as linear as textbooks made it seem. Archaeologists had already uncovered hints of other human-like species. Denisovans, for instance, whose DNA was discovered in a Siberian cave and turned out to be neither fully Neanderthal nor human. But even their genes couldn't explain these new anomalies. The data showed fragments that came from an unknown hominin group, a lineage that, so far, had left behind no bones, no tools, no physical trace. Geneticists began calling them the ghost population. What the scanners detected inside those Neanderthal bones were faint echoes of this missing branch, genes that had somehow passed through them and into us. The idea was staggering. Neanderthals, once thought to be evolutionary dead ends, might have been carriers of a deeper, older intelligence coded into life itself. Pääbo and his team described it cautiously. "It's as if," he said, "there were more actors in the play than we ever knew existed." But behind the scientific phrasing was quiet awe. The more they analyzed, the stranger the genome became. Some segments of DNA showed mutation rates that didn't match the rest of the sequence, as if they had evolved on a completely separate timeline. Others exhibited resistance to degradation, defying what should have happened after tens of thousands of years. These weren't just ancient, they were resilient. If the genome was a history book, someone had written chapters we weren't supposed to read. At first, scientists tried to explain it within the bounds of logic. Maybe these were remnants of early Homo erectus, or some forgotten cousin species. But computational modeling ruled that out. The patterns were too distinct, too structured, and appeared across too many independent Neanderthal samples from different excavation sites: Vindija Cave in Croatia, Mezmaiskaya in Russia, and Denisova in Siberia. To make things even stranger, the anomalies appeared most prominently in sections of DNA linked to brain development, immunity, and cellular repair, the very systems that make humans adaptable. It was as if those genes had been engineered for endurance. That last observation raised eyebrows across scientific circles. Researchers began debating whether these ghost genes were natural or something else entirely. Some argued they were merely evolutionary coincidences, the result of environmental pressures that sculpted similar traits across species. Others weren't so sure. One geneticist, quoted anonymously in a European journal, put it bluntly, "Either evolution has a very strange sense of symmetry, or we're missing a major chapter in human history." Despite their mystery, one thing was clear. The DNA was authentic. Radiocarbon dating confirmed the bones were roughly 40,000 years old, among the last Neanderthals before their extinction. Yet, the genome seemed fresher than it should have been. The preservation was almost unnatural. Even after accounting for the cold cave environment and minimal contamination, the samples defied degradation models. Forensic biologists called it impossible preservation. And there was something else, subtle but consistent anomalies in the way the DNA responded to modern sequencing. Instead of fragmenting predictably, certain sections repaired themselves during testing, resisting full breakdown. Machines would fail to read them properly, only to succeed on subsequent runs without explanation. To the scientists, it was maddening. Every attempt to decode the genome seemed to reveal another question. The deeper they dug, the less they understood. Meanwhile, new Neanderthal samples from other parts of Europe began showing the same pattern, the same strange fragments that didn't belong. If it was contamination, it was happening everywhere. If it wasn't, something extraordinary was buried within that ancient code. By 2020, genome mapping technology had advanced enough to rule out most technical errors. The anomalies weren't glitches, they were real biological signatures. Studies began connecting them to traits in modern humans: metabolic efficiency, pain tolerance, even emotional regulation. These weren't useless leftovers from a dead species. They were active, inherited functions still shaping who we are. The conclusion was unavoidable. Neanderthals didn't disappear. They merged with us and brought along something we still don't fully understand. For every answer genetics provided, two new mysteries appeared. What was the source of these impossible sequences? How could DNA, this old, still be so biologically relevant? And what kind of intelligence, biological or otherwise, could have left such a mark on both ancient and modern humanity? Even the scientists, usually careful with their words, began to admit they'd stepped into unknown territory. The more we map the past, one researcher said, the less human it seems. But the deeper mystery wasn't just what they found in that ancient code, it was how it behaved. Some of those sequences didn't just survive time, they refused to die. The code that shouldn't exist. When the first full sequence of Neanderthal DNA was published, geneticists expected to find an evolutionary echo, a record of a bygone species that had contributed a few stray genes to humanity's mix. What they didn't expect was activity. Certain strands in the sequenced data seemed to react as if they were still alive. In controlled lab environments, sections of Neanderthal DNA exhibited what one researcher called aberrant replication behavior. The fragments were supposed to be inert, fossilized at a molecular level, incapable of any biological response. Yet, when exposed to specific enzymes used in sequencing, parts of the DNA reorganized themselves into coherent patterns. It wasn't life, not exactly, but it wasn't dead either. At the Max Planck Institute, data technicians reported repeated sequencing errors on the same regions of the genome. Machines reading the samples began outputting patterns that couldn't be traced to either contamination or mechanical fault. The same impossible patterns appeared in separate labs across the globe. In every case, the computers showed a strange behavior. Loops of code replicating, correcting, and reordering, as if attempting to restore an original message. That message, whatever it once was, seemed beyond human translation. Scientists began referring to these anomalies as self-correcting segments. A handful of bioinformatics experts believed these sequences might represent a primitive form of molecular repair, the same kind that helps modern human cells fix damaged DNA. But this version was stronger, faster, and far more resistant to decay. If true, it could explain how 40,000-year-old DNA remained readable in the first place, because it was actively protecting itself. The implications were staggering. DNA that heals itself wasn't just an ancient relic. It was a form of biological intelligence. It suggested that Neanderthals, or whatever influenced their genome, possessed adaptations far beyond what modern humans understood. For the first time, scientists began asking a question they were never supposed to ask. What if DNA remembers? This wasn't simple data preservation. The strands appeared to recognize when they were being examined. Once sequencing began, the rate of molecular degradation slowed dramatically, almost like a defense mechanism. And it wasn't unique to one sample. From Croatia to Siberia, from fossilized bone to cave dust, the pattern repeated. In 2018, a team at Stanford University reanalyzed one of the Vindija samples using next-generation sequencing technology. What they found startled even the skeptics. Within one cluster of nucleotides, essentially, the letters of the genetic code, researchers found repeating units that formed consistent geometrical ratios. The pattern matched no known biological structure, yet it appeared across multiple parts of the genome. When visualized through computational modeling, it produced a spiral configuration within the double helix, an internal rhythm of symmetry far too regular to be random. One physicist on the project described it this way: "It's like finding a song in the middle of static, something deliberate inside the noise." Was it simply coincidence? Maybe, but even coincidence has limits. Attempts to translate the pattern into mathematical language yielded strange results. Numerical relationships that echoed the Fibonacci sequence, a ratio found in nature's most perfect designs, from seashells to galaxies. No one was ready to call it proof of intent. Yet no one could fully dismiss it either. When word of these findings reached the public, interpretations split sharply. To the religious community, it was evidence of divine design, a literal signature of creation, hidden inside humanity's genetic history. To secular scientists, it was more likely an unexplained quirk of molecular evolution. But even among the skeptics, a few quietly admitted that the data felt intentional. Melodramatic headlines began to circulate online. Ancient code proves human DNA engineered, and did Neanderthals hold the blueprint to life? Of course, these exaggerated the truth, but they captured a growing sentiment. Something in that DNA wasn't supposed to exist, and yet it did. As research continued, a deeper realization set in. If Neanderthal genes truly contained sequences unknown to modern humans, it could mean that our evolution was not the first draft. We might be the continuation or correction of something older. In that sense, those ghost genes weren't errors at all. They were instructions, passed down through millennia, still whispering to the living code inside us. There's another layer that still confounds geneticists today. Some of the Neanderthal sequences that modern humans inherited appear more adaptive than our own. For instance, studies found that Neanderthal variants in genes related to immunity helped early humans survive viruses and harsh climates. Others affected our skin, metabolism, even emotional responses. In some cases, the Neanderthal versions were biologically superior, more stable, more efficient. How does a species labeled extinct leave behind DNA that continues to outperform its successors? It's as if nature, or something beyond it, was editing humanity across epochs, using one species to upgrade another. What made this more puzzling was how deliberate it seemed. Across every population tested, the same gene clusters reappeared, from ancient Europeans to early Asians. No matter the geography, the same ghost fragments emerged like a genetic watermark. If these patterns were accidental, they shouldn't have survived so uniformly. Random mutation would have scattered them. Yet they persisted, clean, recognizable, and traceable through time. Even as scientists tried to explain it, the evidence forced them into uncomfortable territory. The line between biology and design had never looked thinner. Was it an accident? Divine intervention? Or the fingerprint of an unknown intelligence? Something older than both man and Neanderthal, still echoing in our blood. Whatever the answer, one thing was certain. The code didn't just defy explanation, it defied extinction. If the Neanderthal genome hinted at something extraordinary, what came next was even stranger. Proof that their legacy wasn't buried in the past at all, but alive in us. The Neanderthal within us. When scientists compared the Neanderthal genome to ours, the real shock wasn't how different we were, it was how similar. Roughly 1 to 4% of modern human DNA, depending on ancestry, comes directly from Neanderthals. On paper, that sounds trivial. But in practice, that small percentage influences more of our biology than most people realize. Every time you heal from an infection, sleep in rhythm with the night sky, or react to stress with a racing pulse, you're hearing the echoes of a Neanderthal survival strategy written deep in your cells. Researchers discovered that genes inherited from Neanderthals play a major role in how our immune systems respond to viruses. These genes helped early humans who left Africa survive in harsh, unpredictable climates filled with unfamiliar pathogens. Some of those same genes are still active today, protecting us from diseases, while others make us more vulnerable to autoimmune disorders. It's a trade-off that has shaped humanity for tens of thousands of years. Then came a more intimate revelation. Neanderthal DNA doesn't just control our health, it affects how we feel. Neuroscientists found genetic links between Neanderthal inheritance and modern traits like mood, sleep, and pain sensitivity. People with higher percentages of Neanderthal variants often report stronger emotional reactivity and disrupted circadian rhythms, traits once mocked as primitive but now recognized as evolutionary tools. Maybe we didn't just inherit their DNA, one geneticist said. Maybe we inherited their instincts. And yet, not all of what we carry is ancient. Some of it seems to be learning, even now. When modern scientists began mapping how Neanderthal DNA behaves in the human body, they noticed something unsettling. Certain ancient genes don't just exist, they adapt. In living subjects, specific Neanderthal-derived clusters activate under environmental pressure. One example is the TLR6-TLR1-TLR10 gene complex. Yup, too technical. A trio that becomes more active when the body detects infection. But what caught attention was how quickly it responded. In a study on immune response timing, Neanderthal variants began firing within hours, faster than their modern human counterparts. These genes weren't fossils from a bygone age. They were still working, as though they'd never gone extinct at all. That adaptive capacity hinted at something deeper, a form of biological memory. A system built not only to survive, but to remember how. This realization redefined how scientists viewed our relationship with our extinct cousins. We didn't just coexist with Neanderthals, we merged with them. We became, in a genetic sense, their legacy. What does that mean for who we are? It's one of the most profound questions in modern anthropology. For centuries, Neanderthals were painted as dim-witted, hulking primitives, a failed evolutionary experiment. Yet DNA tells a different story. They were smart, social, and capable of abstract thought. They made art, used tools, and possibly even buried their dead with ceremony. And their genes continue to drive the modern human experience in ways that transcend science. Some psychologists now theorize that our shared DNA may explain aspects of empathy, aggression, and even creative expression. The instinct to protect, to connect, to feel deeply, all may be echoes of Neanderthal consciousness surviving through us. It's an idea both unsettling and poetic. Maybe we aren't the end of their story, but the continuation of it. But it wasn't just about biology. The blending of Neanderthal and human genes, known as introgression, changed evolution's direction forever. Instead of a clean, linear progression from one species to another, our history became a web of overlapping branches. Every human alive today is a product of that tangled inheritance. And here's the strangest part. The more we study our genome, the more we find Neanderthal DNA active in places it shouldn't be. Some sequences seem to influence learning and memory formation, functions previously thought to be uniquely modern. Others appear to affect our sense of smell, our attraction to sunlight, even our appetite for risk. It's as though Neanderthals aren't gone. They're sleeping inside us, shaping us quietly, invisibly, with every generation. What truly separates us from them? Is it the body, or the awareness that the body holds? Several scientists, including Svante Pääbo, the Nobel Prize-winning pioneer of ancient DNA research, admit that the more we uncover about Neanderthals, the less we can say they were fundamentally different. Their brains were slightly smaller, yes, but proportionally organized in nearly the same way. One speculation even suggests that Neanderthals may have possessed unique sensory awareness, heightened emotional intuition, or visual perception that modern humans diluted through evolution. Some researchers have called it ancestral resonance, an almost subconscious memory of ancient cognition still embedded in our nervous system. It's poetic speculation, but one that invites reflection. If DNA carries memory, then our species is not a new creation, it's a living archive. All this points to a truth more complex than the tidy story we learned in textbooks. Humanity didn't emerge from nothing. We evolved with help. Every cell, every instinct, every heartbeat is a record of adaptation and sometimes of inheritance. That's what makes the Neanderthal discovery so humbling. It reminds us that evolution isn't just a ladder. It's a collaboration across time. The 40,000-year-old DNA found in caves and bones didn't just survive, it thrives in our blood, our brains, our behavior. It connects us to an ancient story of resilience written in the language of life itself. Maybe the Neanderthals never truly vanished. Maybe they're the invisible ancestors who gave us the ability to dream, to remember, to evolve. If our inherited code can still react, adapt, and even remember, what if it can also rewrite itself? That's exactly what scientists began to suspect when they stumbled upon the next mystery: a genome that might be editing itself from within. The self-editing genome. For decades, scientists assumed evolution was a one-way street. Mutations happened by chance. Natural selection picked the winners. And the story moved on. But the closer researchers looked at the ancient DNA preserved in Neanderthal remains and in us, the more they began to suspect that evolution might not be as passive as it seems. When teams compared active gene clusters shared by Neanderthals and modern humans, they noticed something extraordinary. Certain sequences seemed to anticipate change. In controlled studies, when human cells containing Neanderthal variants were exposed to environmental stress, temperature shifts, toxins, radiation, the genes didn't just endure the damage. They rewrote portions of themselves. Not randomly, but strategically. Molecular biologists at the University of Tübingen described these responses as adaptive bursts. Instead of waiting for external mutation, the DNA used internal enzymes to snip, copy, and replace sections, almost like an editor revising a sentence for clarity. The mechanism wasn't unique to Neanderthal DNA. Modern human genomes can do this too, but the Neanderthal segments appeared to trigger the response faster and more efficiently. They acted like emergency switches, compressing what could have taken generations of evolution into a single lifetime of cellular memory. To skeptics, it was just a biochemical fluke. To others, it hinted at something deeper. Perhaps life isn't simply reacting to its environment, but learning from it. If DNA can learn, then every species is both student and teacher, rewriting the script of survival in real time. This theory, called genetic memory, suggests that DNA doesn't merely store physical traits. It encodes responses. Stress, fear, and trauma can leave molecular markers known as epigenetic tags, which then influence how future generations react to similar stimuli. Neanderthal DNA, it turns out, carries unusually dense clusters of these markers. Some researchers believe that's why modern humans with higher Neanderthal ancestry tend to have heightened alertness or emotional reactivity. Their ancient code was literally optimized for survival in a brutal Ice Age world. If that's true, then our bodies aren't just descendants of ancient beings. They're participants in an unbroken conversation with them. Perhaps the most startling evidence for self-editing came from an experiment that almost went unnoticed. When a European research team simulated ancient environmental conditions, low oxygen, high cold, limited light, certain Neanderthal sequences in cultured human cells activated dormant genes that hadn't been expressed before. It was as if the ancient code recognized the environment and switched on forgotten tools for survival. One geneticist compared it to booting up an old operating system hidden inside a modern computer. "The software never left," she said. "It was just waiting for the right signal." If DNA truly has the capacity to adapt in real time, it reframes everything we know about evolution, aging, even consciousness. Are we the architects of our own biology? Are ancient instincts still programming our reactions, our fears, our capacity to endure? The implications extend beyond science. Philosophers see in it a metaphor for human resilience, the idea that within every cell lies the blueprint of renewal. Theologically inclined thinkers read it as evidence of divine design, a self-sustaining system woven into creation itself. Whichever interpretation you choose, one truth remains. The Neanderthal genome didn't die with its carriers. It continues to think, react, and rewrite within us every second of every day. And yet, even as researchers celebrate these breakthroughs, they admit they're barely scratching the surface. For every discovered mechanism, another mystery appears. Why do some genes wake up while others stay silent? Why do identical sequences act differently in two people exposed to the same conditions? The closer we look, the less fixed humanity seems. Maybe evolution isn't something that happened to us. Maybe it's something we're still doing, guided by code that remembers a time before we called ourselves human. Who were the people brave enough to uncover the code that changed everything? The DNA whisperers. The DNA whisperers. Every great scientific discovery begins with data, but what truly makes it human are the people who dare to look at that data differently. When Svante Pääbo and his team at the Max Planck Institute began sequencing Neanderthal DNA, they weren't chasing miracles, they were chasing clarity. Their goal was to reconstruct the genome of an extinct species. Nothing more, nothing mystical. Yet as the project unfolded, the numbers stopped behaving the way numbers should. Every few days, one researcher later admitted, we'd get a result that didn't make sense. And when something repeats across multiple samples, you stop calling it an error. They were watching the past push back. In interviews years later, Pääbo described moments of quiet disbelief. The idea that modern humans shared so much DNA with Neanderthals wasn't just surprising, it was unwelcome. The established evolutionary model depended on distance. Homo sapiens as the distinct, triumphant branch that outsmarted and outlasted its slower cousins. But the genome told a different story, one of intertwining, not separation. For a scientist trained to trust data, the emotional weight of that realization was immense. What if the boundaries between species, between them and us, were more illusion than truth? Some researchers reportedly began to avoid public commentary until they could make sense of their own discomfort. One geneticist put it simply, it felt like finding a relative you didn't know existed and realizing they might have been smarter than you. Behind the scenes, the early years of ancient DNA research were marked by skepticism and even ridicule. Contamination was the favorite accusation. Critics argued that the Neanderthal sequences were nothing more than modern human DNA sneaking into ancient samples. To disprove it, Pääbo's team doubled their efforts. They designed sealed environments, controlled every variable, and still, the same impossible fragments kept appearing. Eventually, the replication of results across labs silenced the doubters. But instead of relief, there was an eerie stillness in the community. What do you do? One postdoctoral researcher asked. When the evidence doesn't just change your theory, it changes your species. And the deeper they dug into the code, the more the scientists themselves began to feel studied. Several researchers described an odd sense of unease while working with ancient sequences. It wasn't superstition. It was the emotional dissonance of realizing you were decoding something once alive, once aware. DNA isn't just chemistry. It's continuity. It holds memories of breath, hunger, adaptation, all the things that made life persist. Reading that code line by line is like hearing the thoughts of someone long gone. During one long night of sequencing, a technician wrote in her lab journal, "It feels like they're waiting for us to finish their sentence." That sentence, however, was far more complex than anyone expected. As computing power improved, the Neanderthal genome revealed more foreign patterns, fragments that didn't align with any known human or hominin sequence. Someone jokingly labeled them ghost codes. The name stuck. Even after statistical analysis confirmed the data's authenticity, the mystery only deepened. Every answer created 5 more questions, Pääbo said. It's like decoding a book written by someone who knew we'd be reading it thousands of years later. Fame soon followed the findings, but so did discomfort. Some religious groups hailed the research as proof of intelligent design. Others accused scientists of overstepping, of meddling in sacred origins. Meanwhile, within the scientific world, factions quietly formed. One group saw Neanderthal DNA as an elegant proof of evolution's randomness. Another suspected that randomness alone couldn't explain the self-preserving, self-adapting qualities in the data. But few wanted to be the one to say it out loud. Careers have been lost over less controversial claims. So many scientists learned to speak in measured tones, hiding their awe behind academic phrasing. "We don't use the word miracle," one senior biologist said dryly, "but some results come close." For all the charts and chemical breakdowns, what lingers most from these projects isn't the data, it's the feeling. The quiet moments when a computer finishes running the sequence and what appears on screen is a pattern older than recorded history. It humbles even the most skeptical mind. Because in those sequences, scientists aren't just seeing what Neanderthals were. They're seeing what we still are. Every revelation about the past becomes a mirror. In 2022, when Pabo won the Nobel Prize for unlocking the Neanderthal genome, he said something that captured it perfectly. Through their DNA, they live on in us, and in that way, perhaps, they never really left. That's the paradox of discovery. The closer we get to decoding life's secrets, the more mysterious it becomes. And yet, even with all their knowledge, scientists still can't agree on one thing: what this discovery means. Because the more we learn about our origins, the less certain we become of where they truly begin. What began as a glimpse into Neanderthal DNA became a mirror reflecting who we truly are, a species shaped by mystery, connection, and evolution's hidden hand. The more we uncover, the less we seem to know. Want more untold discoveries like this? Stay curious and subscribe for the next revelation. Thanks for sticking until the end of the video.